Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel, and you're watching our welcome to SQL Server 2008. You may also hear me refer to it as SQL Server, another common term used. But let's jump in. We want to get into, first of all, what is SQL Server, SQL Server 2008 more specifically. So we'll look at that and give you some high-level definitions there. Talk about the SQL 2008 solutions. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the database industry as a whole, and then you look at the Microsoft database application, you'll see some terms that seem to be similar, and you'll see some terms that seem to be dissimilar. And I want to help bridge that so you can understand and compare SQL Server to the general database arena, and also help you if you're transitioning to SQL Server from other products, so you can start to mix and match the components. And then last, we'll be introducing our company that we're going to be building this database application for, right? The best way to learn any product is to just start using it in a real world scenario, as real world as you can get. So we're going to help Veronica build the database for her new nursery plant business, selling these wonderful flowers known as Veronicas that she tells me there's over 500 different varieties of them. So that's a database, that's a table in the database of itself. And then there's all the customers and orders and all the other things we're going to have to keep track of. So that's what we're going to be working on. So let's jump in. Starting off, SQL Server 2008. What are the main players? And I swiped this diagram directly from Microsoft. I didn't take the time to do that. But if you look at the core of that, you have the integration services stuck right there in the middle. And then right around that, your main three players. Your database engine, your integration services, like I said, in the middle, your analysis services, and then your reporting services. We're going to be focusing on the database engine for the most part in these series of videos. I'll spend some time looking at replication as well, but the main thing I want to focus on right now is where most people tend to start. That's really the foundation for SQL Server, is going to be the engine, the database engine itself. Everything else kind of builds on top of or adds functionality around that core engine. Now we're going to come back to those terms. I do want to spend a little time at least saying what they are, but just for now, just to let you know where we're going. Solutions. Here's a quick high level of some of the terms you may see floating around in the database space, such as OLAP or data warehousing. We just put WD there for short, or data mining, DM. OLTP or BI, and also business intelligence, or ETL, extraction, transformation, and loading. Common things you'll hear in a lot of different camps, a lot of different vendors' camps. What are those terms? And let's figure out how they map into this arena here. First of all, what are the terms? So starting with OLAP, online analytical processing. It's really, as the name says, you're doing analysis on data. Typically, I tend to think massive amounts of data. That may not always be the case, but in most of the client environments I've worked in, when we're talking OLAP, we're talking organizations that have not necessarily thousands or hundreds of thousands, but millions or even billions of records in a database. And now they're not just interested in finding a particular record, which they can do, but more importantly, they want to be able to find patterns and trends so that they can make intelligent business decisions based on the information that they have. Data warehousing, actually just think like warehouse. What's a warehouse? A place where you store lots of stuff? Well, same thing here. Just now the stuff is data. Many organizations moved to decentralize data, not necessarily intentionally. Some of them kind of backed into it as another department somewhere else, scattered across the country or even across the same building sometimes, started their own database and had their own information that they kept locally in their group, in their organization. And over time, the need for that information became apparent to other groups within the company. So someone came up with the idea, hey, instead of all these little databases scattered around the company or the organization, we need one big centralized data store, one big data warehouse. So that's something else you'll commonly see in the industry. SQL Server has solutions for that. Online transaction processing. Most people, when they think large-scale databases, are initially thinking OLTP. Think in terms of, travel season and all the people checking in and out of hotels, or Christmas season, all the people buying tons of things, where you've got Visa or Toys R Us website there getting hit with massive amounts of transactions, lots of things going in, lots of things coming out, lots of things being updated. Data mining for data. That really has to do with analysis again. I have lots and lots of information, but I want to dig through that to find the stuff I need to make decisions. BI, or business intelligence, is again looking at how do I make smart business decisions from my data? So really, BI, data mining, and OLAP could be grouped together as all different ways of doing analysis on your information. The last one on the list, ETL, is focused on extracting information from one location, doing possibly some transformations on that information, and then loading it into another location. It's a very, very common practice in many environments where you're constantly moving information from one organization, one team to another organization or another team because they have need of that data. It really goes back to your data warehousing idea. You may find ETL oftentimes associated with a data warehouse where you're constantly pulling information in from those remote databases, possibly doing some transformations on it so that you have it all in a standardized format before you add it to the main data store, to the main data warehouse. But those are some of the general industry solutions you're going to commonly come across. Now, how do they map to SQL Server is the next question. Looking at BI, data mining, and OLAP, as I said, you can lump the three of those together. When you're talking SQL Server actually has a Business Intelligence Studio product that you're going to use as obviously a main interface for doing BI. But then I've shortened the names here a little bit. We talked about analysis services and reporting services. The acronyms you'll commonly see for those are SQL Server Analysis Services, SQL Server Reporting Services. So those are the tools that you'll primarily use for pulling together the information or pulling out the results you need to make business decisions. When you're talking data warehousing, which is lots of information being stored in one location, which maybe these belong together, maybe not, because warehouse is really just storing it. OLTP is actually changing it, adding to it, and reading from it, but you're still talking about lots of information in one place. And that's really what the database engine itself is all about. That's your processor for your information. That's what's going to be operating on your warehouse. That's what's going to allow you to put information in, take information out, update it, delete it. I say delete it with hesitation because most good database designs almost never delete information physically. It's usually a logical delete, but that's another topic for another class. And then when we talk ETL, we're talking integration services. SQL Server integration services, oftentimes referred to affectionately as simply SSIS. But now back to focusing on the database engine itself, because once again, that's going to be the primary focus of this video. Actually, of this entire series of videos. And what is it? It's a relational database. SQL Server is primarily a relational database, and the core of that is really just the database engine itself. All the other stuff you see flying around SQL Server oftentimes were other ideas and other products that in many cases grew up independent of SQL Server and were eventually brought in as an additional component that was available, making SQL Server a more robust, more complete database solution. But if you're thinking relational databases, you're thinking SQL Server Database Engine, also known as an RDMS, Relational Database Management System. It runs structured query language, SQL, and Microsoft has their own flavor of it known as Transact SQL or T-SQL. So it supports industry standard SQL, and Microsoft, as do most vendors, they have their own extensions to standard SQL that can give you sometimes much better performance, and if nothing else, at least sometimes better readability. So it's really cool stuff. Some other tools you'll see with the database engine. Now this isn't really the engine itself, it's the graphical user interface to the engine as well as some other components, and that's the Management Studio. That'll be our primary GUI that we interact with when administering SQL Server. Now some people will cringe when they hear that. You don't need to use the GUI to do most administrative tasks. Many people will do those using T-SQL. You can oftentimes do a lot more using T-SQL. You'll have a lot more options available to you, but there is a GUI that you can use that can make it a little less intimidating when you're first starting out with SQL Server. Performance tools. There's a myriad of tools that we will look at that help you monitor how well your database is performing. And a key thing you need to do as a database administrator is stay on top of that. A mantra of mine is that the best DBAs are almost totally invisible. You never see them. Well, maybe you don't necessarily not see them, but you never really notice them because they're doing such a good job of keeping the database up and running. You're not necessarily calling them constantly to fix things because they're being proactive enough to maintain a database that runs without constant intervention, so to speak. Automation tools. We'll talk about some things you can use to automate SQL Server, automate various things that happen against the database engine. There's Windows integration. Microsoft SQL Server integrates with Microsoft Windows as far as security, as far as managing the various services that are part of SQL Server. SQL Server runs as a Windows service, actually several Windows services. And like I said before, security. So those are some of the things that we'll be looking at as we look at the database engine itself. I also did want to spend a little time talking about analysis and integration services to just once again bring this home. When you're looking at analysis services, you're looking at making business decisions. So if you're looking at massive amounts of data, you want to be able to analyze that to find trends, to find patterns that help you make business decisions. And when we're looking at SSIS, SQL Server Integration Services, we're really looking at an ETL tool for doing extractions, transformations, and loading of data. So what are the terms we've talked about in this video? First of all, we defined OLAP, Online Analytical Processing, right? Data warehouse is really just about centralized data. OLTP, Online Transaction Processing, just slamming in lots of transactions as fast as possible. Data mining is all about getting answers out of your data. I've got lots of data. Give me some answers out of it. Give me the gold out of the data that I have. Business intelligence is similar in that how do I make intelligent business decisions, strategic business decisions based on my data. And then ETL, we talked about, is really extraction, transformation, and loading. A common thing that happens when you're dealing with massive amounts of data, possibly moving it from one database or one location to another location. Other terms, we talked about the data engine itself, which is the core product for SQL Server. Everything else really revolves around that. Integration services is Microsoft's ETL solution. Analysis services is for doing analysis on your database and gets into things such as cubes or three-dimensional objects and three-dimensional analysis of data. Reporting services is Microsoft's reporting package for SQL Server. We talked about the RDMS, or the Relational Database Management System term, what that is. SQL. What is SQL? Structured Query Language, also referred to oftentimes as SQL. And then we talked about T-SQL, Transact SQL, which is Microsoft's extension to the standard SQL language, which gives you oftentimes better performance and oftentimes better readability of your SQL code. So what did we cover? We talked about database technologies at 32,000 feet and 700 knots. So we didn't get into a lot of details on that yet, but I'm trying to lay the framework, the high-level understanding of what is SQL Server and what does it do for me and how does it fit into the whole landscape. That's what I wanted to give you here, and the different Microsoft data solutions. So what should you know how to do at this point? Well, at least pick the right SQL Server tool for the right job, right? If you're interested in just having the ability to take lots of transactions, respond to requests for information, manage updates to data, right? You're really focusing on just the engine. You don't necessarily need the integration services tool installed. You won't necessarily need the analysis services tool. There's lots of tools with SQL Server that you can install later as you need them, and that is the way you want to go. You don't want to go installing everything that comes with SQL Server just because you have it to play with it all at once. If you're only playing with it, that might be a good idea. In a production environment, you definitely don't want to do that. So you want to pick the right SQL Server tool for the job that you need to accomplish. So thank you for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next series of videos covering SQL Server administration.